Ecclesiastes chapter 7. You know, the Apostle Peter said concerning Paul's writings that there are some things that the Apostle Paul wrote that are hard to understand. If you did the reading in Ecclesiastes 7 and chapter 8 that you were supposed to do before class, then you probably came across some of those hard things that are found in the Old Testament. Some of the passages that I was studying for to prepare for this class this morning, I looked at them and I scratched my head and I read over them again and I read over them in another translation and went to some commentaries and things, and there are some difficult passages. And I think they're there for us to think, to dig, to understand things. You know, there's what the Bible calls the milk of the Word, and then there's the meat. And I think we're dealing with some meat here. And so there's some difficult things found therein, but we're going to look at them and see what God's Word says. Look at verse 15. We left off about there. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 15. Solomon says, I have seen everything in my days of vanity. There is a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs life in his wickedness. We talked a little bit about this. We touched a little bit on this last week, and I think a little bit in our sermon this morning. He says, here's what I have observed. That you have a just man, a righteous man, who perishes in his righteousness, but then you have a wicked person who lives a long life. And it's as if he's saying, this just don't seem fair. But later on in the book, in chapter 8, he's going to talk about how that really, whether the righteous perishes early in life or late in life, they are the ones that are the winners. They are the ones that are successful. Whether they live a short life, physically speaking, or a long life, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that they're a just person and they perish in righteousness. They die in righteousness. And so that's the important thing. But remember, Solomon is writing from the standpoint of looking at things under the sun, and he says, look, well, this is what I've observed. This is what I've seen in my days of vanity. You have a righteous person who dies at a young age in righteousness, and you have a wicked man who prolongs his life. I mean, you could talk about people who live to be 80, 90, 100 that have done wicked, terrible things in their life. And you know of good people who have lived a good life, and they seem to be cut off when they're relatively young in their life. Verses 16, 17, and 18 is one of those puzzling passages. Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other. For he who fears God will escape them all. Is there such thing in verse 16 as being overly righteous and overly wise? What's Solomon talking about here? I believe in the context here, in the context of other wisdom literature, I think he's talking about being prideful of being righteous. Having an arrogant attitude about being righteous. What we would call a holier-than-thou attitude, in which you are God's gift to the church, and that everyone should be exactly like you in your behavior, and that you are proud of being a righteous individual and wise. And he says this will destroy you. Now, he's not saying here that it's wrong to be overly righteous in the sense of being genuinely righteous. We should be genuinely as righteous as we can be. We should stay away from sin and abide in righteousness and abide in the doctrine of God and His will as much as possible. We should live a life of perfection as much as we can. We've got to stay away from wickedness, and we should receive wisdom from God's Word. But if it causes you to be haughty and proud, then you are kind of defeating your own purpose. Because God looks down on pride. Isn't that kind of like what you see when Jesus talked about the Pharisee and the tax collector going to the temple and pray, and the tax collector was thankful that he wasn't like other men, and the Pharisee was thankful that he wasn't like other men. And he looked down upon even that tax collector. He said, I'm not like other men. I do this, 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 and this, and I'm not like him. And the tax collector said, God be merciful to me, a sinner. And he is the one, that tax collector went to his house justified, Jesus said, rather than the other. In other words, the Pharisee was exalting himself and flexing his spiritual muscles. Saying, look at how righteous I am. And I believe that's an arrogant attitude that he's talking about here in verse 16. And in verse 17, do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? In other words, you're engaged in wickedness and foolishness. I think what he's talking about here, verses 16 through 18, is maintaining a balance. Don't forget, if you're a righteous person and if you're living a righteous life and you're wise, don't forget you were once foolish. You were once foolish before you got right with God. In other words, don't forget where you came from. So there's maintaining a balance, and he's not talking about, well, I'm not going to be living a really strict Christian life, but I'm not going to be over here robbing banks, beating up people, and killing people. I'm just kind of going to live moderately. That's not what he's talking about. He's dealing with religious arrogance and wickedness. In fact, he's going to talk about how that all have a problem with sin. We all have a problem with sin. He says in verse 18, it is good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. They will escape them all. Now, the person who fears God is going to be righteous and going to be wise, but they're not going to be arrogant about it. They're going to be humble and realize they are nothing without God. They're nothing without God. Let me comment on verses 16 through 18. It's one of those things where I think we got to think in the context of the whole of the Scriptures as to what it's actually talking about. Look at verse 19. Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. More than 10 rulers of the city, wisdom strengthens the wise. True wisdom that's from God. You have this wisdom that strengthens you. It fortifies you more than a city that has 10 rulers protecting it. And so he's again talking about the value of wisdom, of godly wisdom, of humble wisdom, I guess you could say, in contrast to the arrogant wisdom of verse 16. That you have a humble attitude of wisdom and understand that this strengthens the wise more than a city that has 10 rulers. You know, back then a city that had a wall and had rulers in it was a fortified city. If you had 10 rulers in it, then it's really a protected city. Well, he's saying that wisdom is very valuable and it will strengthen you as a Christian, as a Christian too, but in the Old Testament as a saint, as a follower of God. Of course, it would have application in the New Testament as a Christian. Look at verse 20. For there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. That's what a wise person will always understand. And that wise person must always keep that in mind so they're not overly wise or overly righteous to the point of arrogance, because all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans 3:23. You look at Romans 3 verses 9 through 23. Paul is basically saying, look, this is a problem we all have as humans. We have sinned. We have violated God's will. And as you read over and over in Paul's writings, you see Paul's attitude of unworthiness. It's like he's saying in his writings, I'm not worthy to be a Christian. I'm certainly not worthy to be an apostle. But yet he accomplished much good and wrote most of the New Testament. He was always mindful of what he did before he was a Christian, how that he had persecuted the church. And he's saying, I am what I am by the grace of God. I believe that is the godly wisdom that Solomon is speaking of here. So you have sin. I mean, you think of the best person you can think of, that person has sinned. They have sinned in their life. And there's not a good person on the earth who does not sin. There was only one, and that was Christ. He never sinned. Look at verse 21 and 22. Solomon says, also, do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Verse 22, for many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. So here's a person who is hypersensitive to what others are saying about them. What are they saying about me? And they care about it to the point it's bothering them. He said, don't take to heart. Don't be listening in, seeing what people are saying about you. He says, you might hear something you may not want to hear. Then he also says, remember, there are times when you have said something that, as far as cursed others, you have said things that you didn't want others to hear. So it's practical wisdom here. Some people are so sensitive as to what people say to them that they get bent out of shape over just anything that's said. Even if it's in a joking matter, they just can't handle it. They fall apart. They get mad. And he's saying, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't take to heart what everything people say. And if you're always concerned about that and listening in, you want to know what people are saying about you, it's going to drive you crazy. It's not important. Let it go. Verse 23. All this I have proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. Verse 24. As for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find out? Verse 25. I applied my heart to know, to search, and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. I think he's going back to what he said in chapter 2 about everything that he experienced in his life. All the things Solomon engaged in. And he says, look, he's basically saying, I've been there, I've done that, I know. I'm speaking from experience. Verse 26. And I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. Now Solomon here is talking about a woman ensnaring a man. And it can work both ways, a man ensnaring a woman. And here you have this woman in this context dealing with someone who is not spiritually minded, not trying to please God, and it will ensnare the woman whose heart is a snare, and it is a net, it is a trap. You know, in Proverbs chapter 7, he talks about this. Also in Proverbs 5, 3 and 4. And in Proverbs chapter 7, he talks about the danger of a woman pulling a young man away. And the truth can be said of the opposite sex. So it's the the concept of choosing wisely who will be your mate. And did Solomon know about that? He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. 700 wives and 300 concubines. He understood because it says towards the end of his life, those women pulled his heart away from serving God. And he started serving idols towards the end of his life. And remember, he was given a special measure of wisdom more than anyone else. The danger of choosing someone to be a lifelong spouse who is not serious about spiritual things is a danger. Is a danger. He says it's a trap. Notice what he says in the latter part of verse 26. He who pleases God shall escape from her. Or him. He who pleases God is not going to be ensnared. And the concept is, well, you know, I'll convert him. I'll convert her. Solomon probably said that too. Are we smarter than Solomon? So it's the practical information here about choosing someone. And of course this would be in a male-female relationship as far as marriage or anything of that nature that would cause you to depart from the will of God. And I think it's Paul that said, evil companions corrupt good morals. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. The danger that is there is found both in the Old and New Testament. How many young people who were strong in the church, very active in the church, well-grounded in the church, until they got married to someone who was not spiritually minded, who didn't care, and they married them with the hope and with the expectation of converting them. Now, sometimes that conversion does take place, and sometimes that spouse will become just as strong as the person that was a Christian that married them. And when that happens, we all rejoice. Sometimes that doesn't happen. And then you're in a relationship for life with someone who doesn't care about spiritual things. Sometimes it's a woman choosing a man who they're supposed to be choosing as a spiritual leader of their marriage, of their family, but they choose someone who's not a Christian. For the life of me, I can't understand it. I can't understand it. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 6, he says, look, Solomon's saying, look, I've been there. I know. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. Look at verse 27. Here is what I have found, says the preacher, adding one thing to the other to find out the reason. It's interesting here in verse 27, he's talking about using logic. Adding one thing to the other to find out the reason. That's using logic. God wants us to use logic, use proper reasoning. What did he say in Isaiah chapter 1? Come, let us reason together. Reasoning, proper understanding. Adding one thing to the other to find out the reason. Verse 28. Which my soul still seeks, but I cannot find. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. Verse 29. Truly, this only I have found, that God made man, or some translations might say men, or mankind, upright, but they have sought out many schemes. In other words, in verses 27 through 29, I think he's saying, look, here's what I've experienced, here's what I have seen, and you have found women who are wicked, and he's already talked about men, verse 20. So he's basically saying, here's what I find out. God made man upright, or mankind upright, but they have sought out many schemes. Man is created upright. Adam and Eve were created upright. That doesn't mean they're standing up. It's not talking about standing up straight. It's talking about morally. They are upright. They're pure. but then they seek out many schemes. That's talking about sin. Because we're created in the image of God, and God gives us a spirit, Zechariah 12 and verse 1, we're not born in sin. And here's a passage right here that says it. God makes man upright, morally speaking. But then, later on, they seek out schemes. In other words, sin. They do things that are sinful, which makes them sinful. But they're not conceived and born that way. So it goes back to what he was saying before. In verse 20, sin is a problem. It's a problem with men. It's a problem with women. It's a problem with everyone. Sin is the problem. And it's not God's fault because God makes us upright. We give in to the temptation and then we sin. Look at chapter 8 and verse 1. Who is like a wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. Sternness could also be strength of his face changed. So Solomon is asking the question concerning who is a wise man. He can understand the interpretation of something. Man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. Look at verse 2. I say, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever he pleases, or pleases him. So verse 2 and 3 is talking about, here again is wisdom. Do what those who are in authority tell you to do. Keep the king's command for the sake of your oath to God. Your commitment to God goes along with what you do here upon this earth in society. Paul puts it this way in Romans 13, you obey those who are in governmental authority. You obey the laws of the land. The only time you violate them purposely is when those laws contradict the law of God. If they outlawed a Sunday service and said that Christianity was outlawed, you couldn't meet on Sunday, we'd still have to meet. We'd have to do it somewhere secret probably, like the brethren did in the first century when it was outlawed in Rome. But we couldn't obey that law because our loyalty is to God. I'm afraid some would obey it because Christianity isn't that big a deal to them anyway. But those who are loyal to God would still meet, would still assemble together. But you're to obey those who are in authority because they're in authority because God has placed them there. Romans 13 tells us. They're in authority. You obey them. Verse 3. Don't be hasty to go from his presence. In other words, I think this is referring to respect. You show respect to those who are in authority. And do not take a stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever he pleases. So the concept of the king here, or the concept of the governors or someone who's in authority, his job is to enforce righteousness in a society. Enforce goodness in a society. So don't take a stand with an evil thing because you're going to find yourself punished. That's what Paul said. If you want to be unafraid of those who are in authority, keep the laws. Do what is good. You don't have to be concerned about those who are in authority. Look at verse 4. Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 4. Where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful, and a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. So he's going on to say the king has authority. The king has power. And no one basically has a right to say, what are you doing? When you have an absolute monarchy like this, like a king, you don't really question the king. We have the freedom in our nation to question our leaders and to elect our leaders. Even those who oppose those who are in leadership, a Christian would oppose them respectfully. Respectfully. And so if you disagree with the president or the governor, You can say that, but it should be done respectfully. In our society, I think the Christian principle is there of respect. We should be respectful for those who are in power. Even though they might be dirty, rotten scoundrels as far as morality is concerned, we're still to honor them. Verse 5. He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful. In other words, they're going back to obeying the king. And a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. So here's a person who discerns the right time to do something or not to do something in judgment. Verse 6. Because for every matter there is a time and judgment, though the misery of man increases greatly. There's a time for everything. He's already said that earlier in the book. Verse 7. For he does not know what will happen, so who can tell him when it will occur? In other words, we don't know the future. Verse 8. No one has power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit, and no one has power in the day of death. There is no release from that war, and the wickedness will not deliver those who are given to it. Notice verse 8. He says, no one has the power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit. In other words, when it's time to die, it's time to die. You're not going to prevent it. It's time to die. No one can retain that Spirit. And no one has the power in the day of death. You basically submit to death. There's nothing you can do about it. Now, you can help prevent someone from dying, but that's not stopping the death process when death is inevitable. Latter part of verse 8. There is no release from that war, and wickedness will not deliver those who are given to it. Wickedness won't deliver those who are going to die. Look at verse 9. All this I have seen and applied my heart to every good work that is done under the sun. There's that phrase, under the sun. There's a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt. Sometimes there is a ruler who is ruling, and that ruler that rules is for the hurt, not the welfare of the people, but to the hurt of the people. I think we've seen that in our own time. Hitler, Saddam Hussein, people of that nature. And you find that all through the Scriptures of wicked rulers who rule to the hurt of others. Verses 10 through 17, he's basically talking about death and how it comes to all. Look at verse 10. Then I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This also is vanity. So the wicked person, they're going to die, and they're going to be buried, and they have gone from the place of holiness, and were forgotten. They were forgotten. It's a situation where a memory of someone is either going to be a memory that's good, or that person is going to be a memory that's bad, that you wish to forget that individual. Verse 11, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men are fully set in them to do evil. Verse 11 is very interesting. The sentence against an evil work. In other words, because sin is not immediately punished, the hearts of the Son of Men is fully set on them to do evil. In other words, because God doesn't strike dead every person who engages in wickedness and may allow them to go on in their wickedness for years, they think they're getting away with it. That's basically what he's saying. Because something is not done immediately, and God has every right to strike someone down immediately, but because He doesn't always do that. I think we have an example in the book of Acts of Ananias and Sapphira. Struck down immediately. But then you have examples in the New Testament of false teachers who were not struck down immediately. Why? Well, that's God's wisdom. That's God's area of operation. We scratch our head and wonder why, and that's not for us to fully understand. But some people think, well, they've been living all this wicked life all these years, and it seems like they're prospering in it, that their heart's fully set on doing it. I mean, you think of wicked people like Hugh Hefner, the one who came up with the Playboy magazine. And all the wickedness that he has done, all the women he's exploited, all the women who've allowed themselves to be exploited in that pornography. And he's been doing this, since the 50s? I think he got started in the 50s, Hugh Hefner, and has been doing this for a very long time. He's got a mansion, got all these women around him, and it looks as if he's going to get away with it. No. He's not going to get away with it. And so it seems as though, he's got all these material blessings, and he's got all this money, and he's got all of this fame and fortune, and it just seems like that, well, if God really was disappointed with him, wouldn't He curse him? Wouldn't He cause him to have hardship and problems and things of that nature? But it looks like he's doing pretty well under the sun. The way it looks towards us. But if you could look at his soul, how dark and how sick and how pitiful it is, then we would understand better, what Solomon is saying here. People are not going to get away with their wickedness. And they might fool earthly courts, they might dupe people here on earth, but they're not going to get away with it. Look at chapter 8 and verse 12. Though a sinner does evil 100 times, and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God and fear before Him. Here's the one who's going to do well. Those who fear God. Those who do His will. Yet, he says in verse 12, a sinner does evil 100 times, and his days are prolonged. He lives a long life in his wickedness. It's not going to go well for him in eternity. The one who is going to go well in eternity is the one who fears God. Verse 13, but it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before God. Yeah, he might live 80, 90, 100 years, but you think of that in light of eternity. Like a shadow. It will not be well with the wicked. And just because, in verse 11, a person thinks that God, well, He's not punishing me right now, therefore it must be what I'm doing is okay. I must be doing fine. That doesn't make it so. Only those who fear God are the ones who are going to do well, are going to have eternal life, are going to be with God in eternity. And though wicked people live a long time and do a lot of wickedness in their lifetime, it does not mean that they are going to escape God's judgment. Verse 14, there is a vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. And I said this also is vanity. That goes back to what he was saying earlier in chapter 7 and verse 15. He said this is a vanity or a vain thing which occurs on earth. You have a just person, and what happens to them, it seems like it should be happening to the wicked. You ever know someone who becomes a Christian and it seems like after they become a Christian, their life just totally falls apart? Everything goes wrong. Perhaps they get sick and they suffer and they die. But then you have a wicked person who perhaps, maybe they lived a good life to a certain point and they departed from Christ, and after they do that, everything starts going right. Their business increases. They're no longer living for God, but things are going well. And he says, this is what I have observed. But again, the ultimate success comes to those who fear God. He says in verse 14. I said, this also is vanity. So he's looking at things from an earthly standpoint and saying, this is how I look at it. This is how I see it. And he's recording this by inspiration. And he's saying, but really the ultimate outcome will determine whether a person will do well or not do well. And that all hinges on his relationship with God, ultimately. We'll continue in chapter 8, be reading the rest of chapter 8 and chapter 9 for next week.